Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hey everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to be here. This is Part 2 of Who Killed Carmen Wagner. If you haven't heard Part 1 yet, go back and listen to it. It came out on Thursday. Once you're caught up, rejoin us. Also, I have an admission to make. I inadvertently misled you when I said in Episode 1 that this would just be a two-parter. It turns out this story is a little more involved than I thought. It's going to be a three-parter, but still not a seven-parter, just three. Part 3 will certainly be the thrilling conclusion and will be released on Thursday, September 22nd. Let's do it. Let's just jump right into the story. I'll rewind just a little bit to let you settle back into the narrative. It's time to make like beloved Eddie Munson and heavy metal. Kinda Murdery starts now. I pointed out across the canyon beyond the old orchard, and I asked Ryan if there are any shacks or cabins in that canyon. Walford told the DA. One of the fearful theories, it will be remembered, that was almost immediately advanced by the head of the traffic patrol was that Carmen Wagner was held in the cabin of an insane mountaineer. No, there are no cabins in that canyon, Ryan replied to Walford's question. Well, yes, actually, Ryan hesitated. Yes, I guess there is an old shack in there, but that country's been all searched out. The canyon was known as Baker Creek Canyon, and a sinister discovery later was to be made in that region. When I asked Ryan which way he was going, continued Walford, Ryan replied that he was going to the Sibley place, and I said, well, we might as well ride along together because I was going in the same direction. And then I asked Ryan if he knew Carmen Wagner. Several moments of silence followed before Ryan spoke. Oh yes, he said in a sad voice, I knew her very well, because we used to be in school together when we were kids. Then Ryan began to ask the questions as he and Walford rode together on the narrow trail. Are you going to search in this same country tomorrow? Ryan asked with a queer gleam in his dark eyes. No, I don't hardly think so, said Walford, because I don't see anything around here that looks as if it amounts to anything, and I don't believe that the girl will be found around this place at all. Do you think that Carmen is still in this part of the country? Was Ryan's next question. He appeared extremely anxious to hear any opinions as to the whereabouts of the missing girl. I have my doubts that Carmen is still here, said Walford. I'm not certain that she's not somewhere around here, but I am going to stay until I find out. The two men then rode in silence, keeping their thoughts to themselves for about a half a mile along the narrow trail. Ryan then began to ride a little distance ahead of me, said Walford. He began to ride at an angle to the right of me, about a distance of 6 feet ahead. Ryan was riding with his right hand in an odd position in his pants, or white chaps, which are worn by cowboys. Boy, if this wasn't a grim murder story and somebody told me that a man was riding with his right hand in an odd position in his pants or his white chaps, I would think this was an entirely different kind of story altogether. But anyway, back to Walford. I was watching him pretty closely because he was a stranger to me, and some of the things that he'd said had made me suspicious. When he said that the country around there, including the canyon, had been searched thoroughly, I could not believe him because I personally did not think the searchers had covered that territory at all. Ryan put his right hand from his belt down to his chaps at about the knee. I had been told before that besides a Luger revolver, the man also was in the habit of carrying a small .25 caliber automatic, but he did not show any signs of reaching for a gun. Then, Ryan rolled a cigarette as we continued to ride along toward the old Wagner place. I showed him my own revolver, and he examined it critically and then returned the weapon to me. Finally, we came to the old Wagner ranch, and not having seen any traces of the missing girl, we parted company. A week passed, and one day several possemen were making a search near the Frank Bryan homestead. A road ran past the place. 8 feet from the road was a picket fence, which at one point had been nailed to an oak tree. The tree was about 85 yards from the house. Gilbert Sutherland, a posseman, turned his head toward the tree. His glance traveled down the trunk. Between the trunk and the picket fence he saw an object. Hastily he stepped to the tree and ran his hand between the tree and the fence and picked up his discovery. It was Carmen Wagner's hunting rifle. Discovery of the weapon was significant because it meant that the missing girl was without protection. Without the weapon, she was helpless if she'd been kidnapped. Who had hidden the girl's weapon, and why had the gun been concealed so hastily behind the oak tree? Apparently, the murderer or murderers of Henry Sweet had passed along the very road beside which the girl's rifle had been found. Had the killers dragged the captive girl along this very road? And had they discarded her weapon when some possemen were sighted? The gun muzzle was pointed up, and the side of the weapon away from the tree was covered with rust, leading to the belief that it had been hidden a day or two as it was wet from recent rains. There was no rust on the muzzle of the weapon. Had someone fired it recently? Sutherland looked along the picket fence. There he found a bullet hole through a picket. Had the murderers crouched behind the fence and fired at Sweet? After he'd been murdered, had the fiendish killers kidnapped Carmen? Had they harmed her? Or was she held captive in a lonesome shack in the mountains? These baffling questions were foremost in the minds of the possemen when they resumed their frantic search for the missing girl. Her weapon was turned over to the DA as evidence should the posse capture its elusive quarry. Deputy Sheriff Reed, knowing that Carmen was helpless if she was lost in the mountains and without her weapon as a means of defending herself, spurred the searchers on to their greatest efforts. The possemen eagerly climbed the hills and trails until darkness forced them to their campfires in the mountains. Among the tireless searchers were Kenneth Buck, a youth who did chores and odd jobs near Eureka, and Sidney S. Pixton, a truckman who had volunteered their time in the desperate hunt which had led to the discovery of Sweet's murdered body, but so far had failed to uncover any trace of his young and beautiful girl companion, Carmen Wagner. 2 weeks had passed since the beautiful young girl had dropped from sight so mysteriously. Buck and Pixton joined the posse on October 21st. Both had known the missing girl, Buck having attended the Eureka Business College with Carmen Wagner. Buck and Pixton were instructed to search in the vicinity of Coyote Flat. The two men crossed Baker Creek while they kept their eyes peeled for any sight of the girl. The creek bed was dotted with huge boulders or rocks around which the men had to walk in their search. The banks of the creek and the ground were covered with leaves and moss and a few scattered small trees. Other large rocks nested on the banks of the small stream. The plateau known as Coyote Flat was beside the creek, and one of the large rocks stood beside a slope or decline which led to the bed of the stream. On the morning of Friday, October 23rd, just 16 days after Carmen's disappearance, Buck and Pixton, together with the other searchers, ate an early breakfast prepared over their campfires and started out to search Baker Creek. The two men kept close together, occasionally calling out to each other or passing comment on the uncanny absence of the young red-haired girl who was so well known and her big collie dog. Then, almost simultaneously, they made a startling discovery. They had almost stumbled over the body of the faithful dog. Pronto had been shot to death. Oh, jeez, that sucks. Frozen on the spot, Buck and Pixton were so horror-stricken that for several moments neither could speak. Slowly, their startled eyes swept over the ground near the body of the dog. Near the dog's body were footprints. 3 marks were distinct and appeared to Pixton to have been made by a man's shoe. The prints were about 15 feet away from the dog's body. The dog lay on its side in a clearing on a gradual slope up from the creek. To Pixton and Buck, it appeared as though the animal had been shot to death, then its carcass carried to Baker Creek and hurled down beside the large boulder. It was now 10 o'clock in the morning. Marking the dog's body as the center of a circle, Buck and Pixton gradually moved from the animal to search every foot of the surrounding land. They picked up a leather belt which had belonged to Carmen Wagner. It was a black leather belt, and apparently the buckle had been broken from it. Had the two searchers discovered the spot where Carmen had put up a fight for her life against the person or persons who had kidnapped her after slaying Sweet by shooting him in the back? That was the question that interested them. The searchers noticed a faint and very unpleasant odor in the vicinity, but before they could account for it, they suddenly spied the girl's hat half hidden in the sand. White fur trimming was on the red-colored hat, which attracted the glances of Buck and Pixton. An effort apparently had been made to cover the hat with sand as it was half concealed. Another frightening discovery was made in the next few minutes when the searchers saw a large pool of blood. The blood was some distance from where the body of the dog had been found. Obtaining a stick, Buck scratched the blood and found that it was still fresh beneath the sand into which it had soaked. The two men searched for some distance up and down the creek bed, a terrible premonition making itself felt in their minds. Suddenly, they observed a narrow passage only 4 feet wide beside the huge rock and the spot where the body of the dog lay. The searchers had passed this path numerous times, but they now observed 3 footprints leading behind the rock. Cautiously, and with increasing dread, they started to walk along the narrow path. They took several steps, covering about 15 feet, when they saw something which almost made them flee from the spot in terror. They had found the decomposed body of Carmen Wagner. The corpse was concealed, and unless a searcher walked directly toward it behind the rock, it would have remained hidden. By the merest chance, Buck and Pixton had made the gruesome discovery. The body had been buried in a shallow grave and was almost completely concealed by a covering of earth, leaves, sticks, and rocks. Fearfully, Buck removed some leaves and gazed into the blackened face of Carmen Wagner. Pixton drew his revolver and fired 3 shots into the air, the signal which had been agreed upon between the possemen to let the other searchers know that an important discovery had been made. Other searchers, the nearest being a half a mile away, heard the signal and started to the scene over the rough trails. The district attorney learned of this terrible discovery via Kenny Kilburn's radio. He began to look into the recent activities of any person or persons who might be suspected in the 2 brutal and cold-blooded murders. The finger of suspicion at this time seemed to point to 2 men, both residents of the immediate neighborhood. Meanwhile, Buck and Pixton did not touch the girl's body. This was partly because of horror at the sight of the corpse, which had apparently been exposed to the elements for several days, and partly because they realized that to disturb the body might destroy some clue which the coroner or the sheriff's office might find. Buck and Pixton did observe, however, that the girl's wristwatch was missing. Ernest Bull, another searcher, soon joined Buck and Pixton at the grave of the young girl, while other members of the posse slowly made their way in that direction. The day dragged past until the 3 men searched the vicinity for other clues. Nightfall came, and they lighted a campfire some distance from the corpse and prepared to spend the dismal night in close proximity to the grave. Coroner Swanson was notified that Carmen Wagner's body had been discovered on Coyote Flat, and he set out to bring back the corpse. He was forced to camp at night about 4 miles from the plateau, resuming his tedious journey the next day and reaching the grave at 9 o'clock in the morning. One glance showed Coroner Swanson that the corpse was in a very advanced state of decomposition and should be taken to a morgue without waste of time. With the help of the possemen, who were by this time in a revengeful state of mind against the slayer or slayers, Coroner Swanson carefully removed the girl's body and placed it on a stretcher. It was covered with canvas, and the possemen, who had been friends of the slain girl, tenderly brought her body back down the trail to Eureka. Man, this is sad. I can really picture it in my head, having grown up near Eureka, too. Even though I grew up there 60 years later, I bet it hadn't changed all that much. It hasn't changed all that much since I was a kid. While Carmen's body was being removed, threats of lynching rumbled forth, and Sheriff Ross of Humboldt County made quick plans to take 2 suspects into custody to prevent their being strung up on the trees by an infuriated mob. He wanted to prevent any violence to the 2 suspects and let the law and justice provide punishment. Sheriff Ross believed that he knew the guilty person or persons and hoped that if they were taken into custody immediately, he could obtain their confessions for the double murder. While the feverish search continued for the suspects, Dr. J.N. Chain performed the autopsy upon the body of Carmen. He quickly determined by medical examination how the murderer or killers had taken the life of the girl. "The death of Carmen Wagner was caused by 2 pistol bullets," said Dr. Chain. "One bullet struck the girl near her left ear and emerged from in front of the right ear. The second bullet struck her on the left side of the neck, just below the angle of the jaw, and its exit was in front of the temple by the right ear. The second bullet completely went through the girl's neck and partway through her head and was lodged under the skin. The bullet which had passed through her head was lost, but I removed the second bullet from beneath the skin." The second bullet, with its strange and individual markings, was to prove another vital link in the chain of circumstantial evidence that would be woven against the suspects for whom Sheriff Ross was now searching. "In my opinion," said Dr. Chain, "either shot would have caused death, which would have occurred almost instantly and would have resulted in a heavy hemorrhage, which probably would account for the large amount of blood which was found a short distance from the girl's body." Dr. Chain also concluded that Miss Wagner had been dead for several days before he performed the autopsy on her corpse. This belief led me to the conclusion that the girl had been slain a few days after she'd been abducted following the shooting death of her companion, Henry Sweet. What occurred during the terrible period in which she had been held captive? We'll find out more after the break. Hey everybody, we're back. Thank you for taking the time to support the brands who support Kinda Murdery. I'm going to do an abbreviated version of what I usually talk about in this section. So please, if you need support and you want to connect with someone, don't hesitate to reach out to the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. If you're in acute crisis, please remember the number 988. It's free and you can dial it to receive suicidal, substance abuse, or mental health related support. Remember that you are loved, you are cared for, and the world is a better place with you in it. Also, not being glib here at all, obviously addiction, suicidal thoughts and mental health are very serious subjects. But it just occurred to me that I always say if you're in acute crisis. And in case, because I just heard it this way this time for the first time, in case when you hear me say that, it sounds like I'm saying acute crisis, like, oh my gosh, isn't that puppy cute? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying acute as in serious and immediate, cannot be ignored. ACUTE, not A space CUTE. If you're not in acute crisis, but you'd like some support, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, kindamurdery@gmail.com. And lastly, thank you for leaving reviews. They really do help the show get discovered as they trigger algorithms on the podcasting platforms that make it more visible. So if you could take a moment and leave a review, that would be awesome. And with that, buckle up for the continuation of Who Killed Carmen Wagner. Kinda Murdery resumes now. So what had happened during that awful time after the murder of Henry Sweet and before the murder of Carmen Wagner? One of the beliefs expressed by the officers who visited Coyote Flat, where her body had been found, was that it had been attacked. The corpse was so badly decayed, however, that at this point it could not be determined with a positive degree of accuracy. Another startling and terrifying theory was that Carmen had been offered as a blood sacrifice on the mystic shrine, which some observers seemed to see in the arrangement of tree trunks and bark near her grave. Alright, that sounds cuckoo bananas, but I guess it's always great to blame the devil where you can. Usually, the devil is inside of us. Returning to more practical beliefs, Coroner Swanson had a good hunch as the autopsy was being performed. He reasoned that a young girl facing an attacker would attempt to scratch the man's face, and that beneath her fingernails perhaps there would be found skin and flesh particles which might enable a criminologist to learn the identity of her attacker or attackers, provided we succeeded in arresting them. Coroner Swanson therefore caused each fingernail of the corpse to be scraped and the substance from each placed in 10 separate envelopes. Faced with the tremendous problem of bringing the slayers of both the young man and Carmen to justice, the DA sought the best criminology assistance that could be obtained. Word was sent to Dr. E.O. Heinrich of Berkeley, California, that he was wanted to help solve the mysterious murders of Coyote Flat. Dr. Heinrich devoted his life to the study of criminology. Many of his celebrated solutions of baffling crimes repose in the records of brilliant detective work. One of Dr. Heinrich's clever pieces of sleuthing was in the solution of the, and I'm going to mispronounce this, D'Autremont case, which occurred in Oregon several years earlier. A train was held up and 3 robbers killed several of the crew in their desperate attempt to get at the money and valuables in the mail car. The robbers were driven off, but not before they'd ruthlessly killed the trainmen. Dr. Heinrich was called on the case. He didn't have much to work on, but he took the robbers' discarded overalls and by a clever solution was able to describe the train bandits, even going so far as to point out that one of them was left-handed. With this information, the 3 D'Autremont brothers finally were captured, confessed that they were the robbers, and each was given a life sentence in the penitentiary. There are several other examples of Dr. Heinrich's Holmesian genius, but I'd rather stick to our story. As it happened, Dr. Heinrich was near Eureka investigating a comparatively minor case when his services were sought to help solve the mysterious murders of Coyote Flat. He came at once to Eureka to seek evidence in the murders. All available evidence was immediately turned over to Dr. Heinrich. This included the 10 envelopes containing the substance taken from beneath Carmen Wagner's fingernails, together with her clothing, hat, and belt, and other articles. Placing the articles of evidence in suitcases, Dr. Heinrich returned to his laboratory in San Francisco to inspect the physical aspects of the case and arrive at a conclusion as to the possible identity of the murderer or murderers. In the meantime, Sheriff Ross had been busy arresting 2 subjects in connection with the slaying. The 2 subjects lodged in the jail at Eureka were Walter David and Jack Ryan, the half-Native American brothers. Let's hope they weren't only suspected because they were Native American. Fingers crossed that some real evidence is coming. Their arrests were dramatic and had followed quickly after the discovery of Carmen Wagner's body. Deputy Sheriff Reed placed Jack Ryan under arrest at the Deer Creek Ranch, which was located about 6 miles east of Coyote Flat, where the bodies of Sweet and Miss Wagner had been found. Reed and members of the posse broke into Ryan's cabin and found him in bed. It was 10:30 at night, about 12 hours after Carmen's body had been discovered in the shallow grave. Ryan was told to dress quickly, which he did, but he did not put on the white chaps which he had worn the day he met Kenneth Walford on the trail by the old Wagner place. He tossed the chaps carelessly in the yard of the ranch. "Have you got a gun?" Deputy Reed asked Ryan, who stood trembling and ready to be taken to jail at Eureka. "Yes," Ryan answered. "You'll find it in the barn with my saddle." George Wilder, a member of the posse, hurried to the barn and found the gun, a German Luger. Wilder handed the gun to Reed, and the officer and his prisoner began the horseback ride to Eureka. Handcuffs were slipped around the wrist of the suspect as the deputy sheriff and the possemen did not want to give their prisoner an opportunity to escape into the darkness as they followed the narrow trail through the mountains. The DA met Reed and his prisoner upon their arrival at the jail, where Ryan was hustled at once into the private office of Sheriff Ross for questioning. And plenty of questions were hurled at the man. There was reason to believe he was involved in the double murders. Before he could think of an answer to one question, someone would hurl another question at him in an attempt to confuse him and make him tell all he knew about the mystery. In an effort to frighten the suspect, someone told him that the human eye retained the image of the last thing it had seen before death. An attempt was made to make Ryan believe that Carmen's eyes would hold his image. Ryan only shrugged. Ryan readily admitted that the pistol found in the barn belonged to him and added that he owned several weapons. He explained this by saying he often supplied hunting parties with pistols and rifles when he acted as a guide. Added weight to the suspicion against Ryan followed the announcement by Deputy Sheriff Reed that he'd found 2 pistol shells at Coyote Flat about 10 or 11 feet from where the girl's body was discovered, and the shells exactly fitted the Luger pistol which Ryan admitted owning. Several similar shells were also found in Ryan's cabin at the time of his arrest. Well, that seems awfully conclusive, but maybe somebody else has a Luger? Working swiftly to prevent flight from the country, Reed also arrested Ryan's half-brother, Walter David. David's cabin, where Ryan often spent his leisure time, was located only 3 miles south of Coyote Flat. The possemen, led by Reed, quickly surrounded David's cabin and called to him to come out and surrender. He responded without resistance and was placed under arrest. The demeanor of the 2 half-brothers as they were placed under arrest for the 2 hideous crimes was noted particularly by Deputy Sheriff Reed. Ryan was very nervous and seemed greatly excited, Reed said, but David did not appear very much excited, or nervous either for that matter. In fact, Reed said David was rather genial about his arrest, even inviting the possemen to have coffee with him because he was at breakfast when the officers arrived. Suddenly, however, Reed and his deputies became aware of something peculiar and sinister about David's face. It had been scratched and clawed, as though by the fingers of a girl fighting desperately for her honor and her life. Another peculiar incident was the fact that neither suspect asked the reason for his arrest. No protest was made according to the officers, and each man went meekly to the jail. Other evidence gathered included the white chaps which belonged to Ryan, and most sinister of all, a coat owned by Ryan. The coat bore many deep blood stains on the sleeves, shoulders, lapels, and even on the back. And the keen eyes of Dr. Heinrich discovered a broken needle in the right lapel of the coat. This needle had been broken, Dr. Heinrich believed, by pressure when its wearer lifted a heavy burden in his arms, such as the weight of the corpse. It was learned that the 2 half-brothers had ridden many times on horseback through the Coyote Flat region while the search for Sweet and Miss Wagner was in progress. They admitted having crossed Coyote Flat where the girl's body was discovered, and Ryan said that he'd helped the posse search for a short time, but was not asked by the officers to give all his time to the hunt. The sinister deep scratches, like gouges made by fingernails on David's face, had been noticed by several persons. "I saw the big raw furrows on David's face," said W.H. Wonderly, a carpenter of Eureka who had been a member of the posse. "David's face was scratched badly, apparently with something which had drawn down toward his chin, and there was one deep mark near his nose. I noticed the scratches on October 23rd, the same day the body of Carmen, who used to live a block from my home, was found." Wonderly said that the scratches appeared old and there was no blood on David's face. Mrs. Mildred McGowan of San Francisco also had noticed the scratches on the man's face. Mrs. McGowan each summer resides in Humboldt County, and she knew David, who had broken wild colts for a time on her husband's ranch. Walter McGowan, a San Francisco attorney, had taken up the defense of David, whom he believed to be innocent of the fiendish slayings. "I first saw the scars on David's face sometime between the middle of August and the time of the Fortuna Rodeo, held about August 21st. Said Mrs. McGowan. "At that time, David came to our summer residence at Forest Lake with his face scratched and bleeding. I watched his face with witch hazel during the time he was there in the afternoon. The scars are quite deep, one raw cut running down under his left eye. David said he was anxious to have the scars treated so they would heal and permit him to ride his horse in the rodeo." Were the scars which Miss McGowan observed on David's face before the murders of Sweet and Miss Wagner the same marks found on David's face after the girl had been slain? David contended that the marks were the same, and he denied any knowledge of the murders. And he also emphasized that he was at the McGowan place at the approximate time Carmen was believed to have been slain. The DA believed, however, that the mass of circumstantial evidence against the 2 suspects was overwhelming, and he made preparations for presentation of the facts to the court. The half-brothers were arraigned for their preliminary hearing before Justice of the Peace J.T. Frazier. The evidence was assembled. Many witnesses had observed the deep scratches on David's face and were ready to testify. Others who'd seen the 2 suspects in the vicinity of Coyote Flat, the Luger shells found at the scene of the crime which fitted Ryan's revolver, Ryan's blood-stained coat with the broken needle in the right lapel, and finally, Carmen's tiny wristwatch had been found concealed in the right knee of the white chaps which Ryan had worn. Oh, that is damning. Overwhelming evidence appeared to point conclusively to the guilt of the two brothers. The evidence, of course, was circumstantial. No one, as far as we knew, had seen Sweet murdered, nor had there been any witness to the cruel death of Carmen Wagner. The suspects were guarded against any possible violence from the many friends who had known and respected Sweet and Miss Wagner in their lifetimes. Their preliminary hearing began before Justice of the Peace J.T. Frazier at Eureka on November 25, 1925, about 1 month after the bodies had been found. Among the experts summoned by the prosecution was the previously mentioned criminologist Dr. E.O. Heinrich. Upon his arrival in Eureka, Dr. Heinrich, accompanied by Sheriff A.A. Ross of Humboldt County, at once made his way over the narrow trails and rough territory to the spot where Carmen's body had been found on Coyote Flat. The criminologist stood in deep thought at the scene of the terrible crime, endeavoring to visualize the actions of the slayer or slayers who had killed Carmen. Near the shallow hole from which the girl's bloody corpse had been removed, Dr. Heinrich's keen eyes suddenly discovered a tree trunk which apparently had been cut and fashioned by someone. The tree appeared to be a shrine. Wait. It really is the devil's fault? Had a religious fanatic, or possibly a pair of demented men, made a sacrificial offering of Carmen Wagner before she was slain? This terrible theory was pondered by Dr. Heinrich. The tree and the arrangement of the slabs of thick bark had every appearance, it was thought, of having been made as a crude shrine for the blood offering of its beautiful victim. Jeez Louise, isn't this story bad enough? Perhaps the girl had been offered to some dark god or to Satan as a sacrificial offering, like a goat or a sheep. Possibly she had escaped a more horrible ritualistic death when her desperate resistance caused her to be shot down with the Luger pistol, the 2 bullets piercing her head and causing almost instantaneous death. Perhaps some fiend who lived somewhere in the inaccessible mountains had taken the girl prisoner after slaying Henry Sweet, and had dragged Carmen for 5 miles along the bed of the stream so that her footprints could not be followed. This theory was partly verified when the autopsy over the girl's body disclosed a rope burn. The burn seemed to point to the fact that a horseman had dragged the girl along behind his animal to the mysterious shrine fashioned from the tree trunk. Oh my God. All the evidence gathered by Sheriff Ross and his deputies was turned over to Dr. Heinrich. The criminologist devoted considerable time to the study of the evidence, including the Luger pistol and the shells found at the scene of the murders, the bullet taken from the girl's head, and the blood-stained coat belonging to Jack Ryan. Then came the preliminary hearing of the 2 suspects before Justice of the Peace Frazier to see whether the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to justify both men being held for trial in Superior Court on charges of murder. Sheriff Ross hustled David and Ryan from the jail to an outer room just beside Judge Frazier's courtroom. By stipulation, both of the accused men were placed under guard in the outer room, and the DA prepared to show enough of the evidence against them to cause them to be held for trial on murder charges. One of the most important witnesses was Dr. Heinrich, and the evidence he had gathered was vital to the case. At the preliminary hearing of the brothers, the defense attorneys made strenuous efforts to block any testimony offered by Dr. Heinrich. The qualification of Dr. Heinrich to testify on the state's behalf was questioned by the defense, who contended that only a physician could determine the nature of the matter from beneath the victim's nails. But Dr. Heinrich was easily qualified when the DA asked him how many years he'd been engaged in criminal research. 15 years, replied Dr. Heinrich, who was then ordered by Judge Frazier to tell what he had found. I found in the particles from beneath the girl's fingernails, after it had been dried and separated, grains of earth mixed with 12 tiny particles of a substance which I identified as the outer skin of a human person, and 1 large particle of flesh without any skin attached, said Dr. Heinrich. I also examined the bullet taken from the girl's skull. I compared the caliber of the bullet with the caliber of the pistol by direct measurement. The pistol in question was the weapon which one of the 2 brothers, Jack Ryan, admitted that he had owned. I compared the markings of the rifling upon the bullet with the riflings found within the barrel of the pistol, and found them to be the exact same in number, width, and depth, testified Dr. Heinrich. Dr. Heinrich had conducted an extensive experiment with the bullets in his laboratory. He had arranged a target of paraffin 9 inches in depth, and into this substance he had fired the bullets from Ryan's pistol. Then Dr. Heinrich dug the bullets from the paraffin and compared them with the bullets which had been taken from Carmen's skull. Dr. Heinrich then testified, over the heated objections of the defense, that in his opinion the Luger pistol owned by Jack Ryan fired the bullet which had caused the death of Carmen Wagner. Next, the heavy coat owned by Ryan, a garment made of leather and heavy canvas, was introduced as evidence. Dr. Heinrich had examined the garment. I found the coat liberally marked with bloodstains, testified the criminologist. The stains were in the front of the coat and particularly on the left sleeve. I found a series of more recent stains upon the right side of the coat, starting with the collar and extending in small spatters all over the area of the left front of the coat. In particular, the blood had soaked through the outer material and had stained the corner of the pocket through a depth of 3 inches. Then, Dr. Heinrich pointed out the sinister significance of the broken needle. Upon the inside of the coat lapel, I found a needle, and it had been there for a long time, he said. I examined the needle and found that it had been broken in the center very recently. The needle was fastened in the coat lapel by old rust. The needle had been broken, Dr. Heinrich believed, when the wearer of the coat had lifted a heavy object in his arms, such as Carmen Wagner's corpse. The defense attorneys stubbornly and repeatedly attacked the testimony and the qualifications of Dr. Heinrich, whose testimony was damaging, obviously, to the 2 accused men. The defense's attempts to impugn Dr. Heinrich's expert testimony were less than successful. Answering more questions from the DA, Dr. Heinrich next told of the deep scratches he'd observed in the face of Walter David when the suspect was held in jail. A powerful light was shone directly onto David's face as he was subjected to countless questions by Sheriff Ross and the other officers. I observed deep scratches on David's face extending along the right cheekbone down into his beard, said Dr. Heinrich. The scratches had been extremely deep and had been made through both layers of the skin into the raw flesh. The scratches indicated to me that David had been clawed at least 3 times. And from beneath Carmen Wagner's fingernails, bits of skin and flesh had been scraped. Another steel link in the chain of circumstantial evidence was added with the discovery of Miss Wagner's tiny wristwatch hidden in the lining of the white chaps which Ryan had discarded so carelessly beside the barn when the posse placed him under arrest. The discovery of the watch was made by Kenneth Walford. Obeying a strange hunch, Walford had walked up to where Ryan's chaps had been thrown on the ground beside some horse saddles. The posseman looked at the chaps, then turned and started to walk away. "Guess I'll search the chaps," Walford remarked, suddenly picking them up. Other possemen looked on while Walford raised the chaps at arm's length. I questioned young Walford as to how he had searched the chaps. "Well, I picked them up, I held them out, and I looked at them," said Walford. "I looked down through the lining, then I held them by the belt and felt them all the way down with the flat of my hand, but I did not discover anything. Then I laid them down and I started to go away." A strange thought flashed through my mind. I remembered having ridden along the trail with Ryan near the old Wagner place when Ryan had told me that the Baker Canyon had already been searched out in the vicinity of where Carmen Wagner's body was found. Ryan at that time, Walford recalled, had made a mysterious motion toward the knee of his chaps as they were riding together along the narrow trail. "I wasn't satisfied after I laid the chaps down," Walford continued, "so I again felt through them inside and out, and at the bottom seam of the chaps there was an object which felt hard. I commenced working it toward the top and upper part with my fingers and forced it along between the lining and the outer part of the chaps. At last, I worked it out to a rip in the lining, and it was Carmen's watch." Miss Wagner's parents and her brother identified the watch as having belonged to the girl. "That watch was an old-fashioned one," Mrs. Wagner said with tears in her eyes when she was asked to identify the timepiece. "It had 3 scratches on the back cover. It had been made into a wristwatch with a sort of leather covering, and that watch belonged to my daughter." Dr. Heinrich examined the watch, which no longer had the leather covering when found in Ryan's chaps, and determined that attempts had been made to scratch off the markings and initials on the back cover. Then, the defense sprung a surprise. It showed that a bitter hatred was held by Walford against the defendant Jack Ryan, and that Walford at one time had rushed from the posse camp with a rifle in his hands and avowed his determination to get that Ryan. The circumstances of the youth's desire to avenge the murder of Carmen Wagner, whom he believed had been slain by Ryan, were dramatic. The posse was camped at night around a fire, waiting for dawn to resume the search for the girl. Walford was restless and anxious to pursue the hunt single-handed in the darkness and over the twisting trails. He could not even wait for daylight to start out by himself. Hurriedly preparing some sandwiches, young Walford, who was only a boy of 20 years, set out on foot alone. The boy was a good shot, as he had hunted many times through the region. He grabbed 2 weapons from the armament of the posse, one a hunting rifle and the other a pistol. Walford's anger had increased because he had known the Wagner girl for about 3 years, and he had liked her very much in his boyish way. In fact, the names and initials of the young couple had been carved in trees and on a wooden shack near Coyote Flat. "I'm gonna get that bastard Jack Ryan," Walford cried passionately. Several possemen attempted to detain the youth, but he shook them off angrily. "I intend to get Ryan and find out for myself from him if he knows about the murder of Sweet and the disappearance of Carmen," Walford told the other men. "I believe Ryan knows something about the murder of Sweet." Walford then broke away and ran toward Coyote Flat. He had been gone for several minutes when the possemen, after talking over his impulsive action among themselves, decided that they'd better overtake and disarm the boy. They set out on horses and soon overtook the youth, who was on foot. Riding their horses around him, they forced him to stop and grabbed his weapons from his hands. Against his vehement protests, Walford was led forcibly back to posse camp. Early the next morning, the boys set out again, carrying a pair of field glasses and a hunting rifle. Some distance away from the camp, he halted and turned around, observing the other possemen watching his movements. Then, Walford focused the powerful lens on a hill 3 miles away across a deep valley. A figure suddenly leapt into the youth's vision. Walford raised his rifle, although he knew there wasn't the barest chance of hitting the mysterious figure which crouched on the distant hillside because the rifle bullet would not carry that far. The district attorney, wishing to obtain every bit of evidence to assist him, asked Walford the reason for his angry attitude against Jack Ryan. "I saw the tracks of Ryan's horse in that neighborhood," the youth said. "The tracks could be seen plainly, although I never saw Ryan, who said he was in a different part of the country when we were searching. I know the tracks were made by his horse because he rode a colt which had not been shod, and the right front foot made a peculiar large track. These strange tracks had been made by the horse going in 2 directions, and some of them led into a box canyon which Ryan told me had been thoroughly searched out. The colt had recently been broken, but still maintained many of its wild bucking habits. Remember this fact." Alright, we're going to pause our story right there. Please do join us this coming Thursday, September 22nd, for the real, thrilling conclusion of Who Killed Carmen Wagner. That's Carmen Wagner Part 3 this Thursday, September 22nd, only on Kinda Murdery. And please do remember that friendships are made when we spend quality time doing something we care about together. And I would like to thank you, my friends, for spending quality time with me. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers. Leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.